Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are getting into one of history's most influential figures, Abraham, but we are definitely skipping the version you might remember from childhood.
Yeah, we really are.
Our whole goal here is to understand Abram, the man from Mesopotamia, the person he was before he became the father of faith.
Exactly. Because when Genesis 12 introduces him, he's already 75 years old, and he's moving from this sophisticated city, Haran. If we start there, we miss almost everything.
Right.
Our mission today is to kind of step back and immerse ourselves in the ancient world he came from, just so we can appreciate how radical, how completely disruptive his story really is.
We've got this incredible stack of material, and it really is a shortcut to understanding the sheer scale of this divine call.
Yeah.
I think we need to focus on three things.
Okay.
First, the incredibly sophisticated and deeply polytheistic world he left behind. Second, the totally impossible promises he gets. And third, the surprising realism of his immediate response.
Which includes that spectacular failure right out of the gate.
Oh, yeah, an immediate and spectacular failure. But the narrative presents his selection as, completely unmerited. If you look at his background, the choice seems grounded purely in divine initiative.
Not in human worthiness. He really does emerge as an ordinary man of his time, just deeply shaped by that ancient urban world.
Okay, let's unpack that starting point. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. When we talk about of the Chaldees, his birthplace, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, you said it earlier, we're not talking about a tent encampment in the desert. Far from it. Was the capital of a huge, fertile, really populous region.
Like a major hub.
You should think of it as the New York or London of his day. I mean, an urban marvel.
Yeah.
Sir Leonard Woolley's archaeological work back in the 1920s, it just uncovered this world of monumental architecture, schools, archives, sophisticated jewelry.
And massive trade networks, right?
Massive. So if Abram was leaving he wasn't running from poverty. He was abandoning the absolute center of global commerce and culture at the time.
That's a crucial point. His family then, the House of Terra, they must have been pretty well off.
Oh, for sure. Likely very prosperous, a substantial means. They were part of a sophisticated, semi-nomadic group, Semitic people, maybe connected to the Amorites, who had these strong ties to the city, but were also mobile.
So they moved around, but were still connected to this major urban center.
Exactly. Imagine moving goods like copper or even lapis lazuli, that incredible blue stone that came all the way from modern-day Afghanistan. His family was integrated into global trade.
That detail about the lapis lazuli really brings it home. He's connected to a world spanning thousands of miles. But the thing that really stands out to me is the spiritual environment. What kind of gods did this worldly, wealthy family worship?
And that's the core tension, isn't it? The text in Joshua is explicit about this. It says his ancestors served other gods. The whole religious environment of was profoundly polytheistic.
And it was centered on the heavens.
Yes, specifically on the moon. Both and his eventual destination, Haran, were massive centers dedicated to the lunar deity Sin, the moon god.
The moon god. So not some abstract concept, but something visible, powerful, right there in the night sky every single night.
Absolutely. The great ziggurat of that massive tiered temple you see in pictures, was built for Sin. Religion wasn't, an hour on a Sunday. It was woven into everything: daily life, rituals, omens, astrology.
So Abram grows up completely steeped in a culture where the spiritual is tangible, it's visible, and it's completely interwoven with power and wealth.
Right. So when his father, Terah, decides to migrate from up to Haran in northern Syria, this is not some kind of spiritual quest.
No, it's a business decision.
It's a practical commercial move. Haran itself was a key commercial hub. Its name literally means highway or road. And crucially, it was another major center for moon god worship.
So he just moves from one sophisticated moon-worshipping culture to another.
Yep. So there he is. He's 75 years old, settled in Haran, wealthy, secure, and completely integrated into this culture.
And it's at that exact moment, at 75, settled and successful, that this radical command comes. And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because the narrative makes it so clear that the selection was just completely unmerited.
That's the key theological observation. Scripture offers no reason, no justification for God choosing this specific man. His history makes him a completely unlikely candidate.
It's a statement, then.
It is. It tells us that God's plan starts not because of human worthiness, but because of the sovereign freedom of divine grace.
Okay, let's focus on the command itself. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. It sounds so simple, but
Oh, it's devastating. This is what we call the threefold separation, and you just can't overstate how disruptive this was. In the ancient Near East, your identity, your legal protection, your social security, your very survival was tied to your extended family, your clan.
to sever all three of those ties, it's like asking for social and economic suicide.
It's a deliberate destruction of his entire security framework. And like you said, he was 75. He wasn't some young man looking for an adventure.
And the destination is so vague. To a land that I will show you.
Right. No map, no deed, no 5-year plan. It was just a raw command to live purely by faith, abandoning everything certain for a future he couldn't see.
But with this terrifying command came these magnificent, almost ludicrous promises. The sixfold covenant.
They had to be magnificent to get him to move. They were the fuel for the journey. First, the promise of a great nation, which, implies you need land and descendants.
Of course.
Then he will be blessed. His name will be made great, and this is important. He will be a blessing to others.
And then that last part, the universal aspect. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It's just mind-blowing in its scope.
It is. And I find the contrast with the Tower of Babel builders just so compelling here.
Say more about that.
Well, they tried to make a name for ourselves through their own human self-centered effort, right? And the result was chaos and scattering.
But Abram is just given a great name as a gift.
Exactly. As a gift. Solely so he can be a conduit for a divine blessing to the rest of the world. It defines this whole shift in the narrative. God is moving from this cosmic history like Babel to family history with Abram to fix the human problem.
But if you just stop and think about the practical logistics for a minute, this entire project seems, completely doomed from the start.
It does. And that's the paradox of the promise. He's 75, he's promised a great nation, but his wife, Sarai, is explicitly named as barren.
The text makes a point of telling us that. Genesis 11:30, she is barren.
It's stated so bluntly. The very foundation of the promised descendants was structurally impossible. It's designed to make sure that the listener, and Abram himself, understand that the fulfillment of this depends entirely on God's power, not on human viability or fertility.
So the call is given, the promises are extravagant, the circumstances are impossible. How does this seasoned, wealthy man of Mesopotamian culture actually respond?
And initially, his response is, well, it's exemplary. He obeyed. He just left Haran at 75, took his wife, his nephew Lot, all their possessions.
And when he gets into Canaan, he doesn't just wander around. He publicly stakes his claim.
He does. He travels south. God appears to him at Shechem, and he stops and publicly erects these altars. First at Shechem, then later between Bethel and Ai.
And these altars weren't just piles of rocks.
No. They were symbolic. They were visible reminders his covenant with this invisible God. It was a way of publicly claiming the land and memorializing the promise.
But then, right after this powerful act of faith, this public declaration, the highly realistic part of the narrative kicks in.
The panic response.
Yes, we shift from covenant keeping to this immediate, very human panic response.
A famine strikes the land almost immediately after he arrives. And instead of building another altar or, consulting God, Abram just defaults to an old survival mechanism.
He goes down to Egypt.
He goes to Egypt, the ancient symbol of security and grain and provision, without seeking any divine guidance. He basically takes the promise into his own hands.
Which leads directly to that notorious lie about the wife incident.
It's a fascinating and kind of uncomfortable look at the flawed nature of this hero figure. To save his own skin, he tells Pharaoh that Sarai is just his sister.
And this wasn't just a small white lie. It was a direct and serious threat to the whole covenant promise.
A massive threat. If Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's harem, the promised heir, the one through whom the great nation is supposed to come, well, the whole thing is jeopardized.
What's so striking to me is that this isn't presented as a one-off mistake. If you look deeper, you see this specific failing, this lie about the wife, is repeated 3 times in Genesis.
Yes, twice with Abraham and once with his son Isaac.
Why the repetition?
I think it's meant to underline a tendency, not just for the patriarchs, but for Israel throughout its history, to revert to human manipulation and deceit rather than just relying on God's word.
It highlights that tension between the demand to trust and the rational improbability of it all.
Exactly. So he risks the entire covenant to save his own life. And yet, what happens?
He gets away with it. More than that, actually.
This is where we see the power of divine grace in this story. Despite Abram's faithlessness, despite the risk he took, God intervenes. Pharaoh is cursed, Sarai is protected, and Abram leaves Egypt not punished, but vindicated.
And even richer than he had come.
He gets blessed in spite of his disobedience. The lesson there, for Abram and for the listeners, is about God's patience and faithfulness. It showed Abram that the future lay with God's power, not with his own cleverness or craft.
So God keeps his promises, even when the recipient is flawed and faithless.
That's the core message. And this amazing realism, the unlikely candidate, the impossible promise, the immediate failure, the intervention of grace, it brings us to the literary context. Why did Israel preserve these stories with such candid, unflattering detail?
That's a great question.
Well, we need to make a quick literary distinction in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the prehistory. That's generally viewed as myth, and I mean myth in the literary sense, cosmic history, stories about universal origins not meant as literal history.
So stories about how the cosmos works, creation, the flood, Babel.
Precisely. But chapters 12 through 50, the patriarchal stories, are better termed legend. These are stories built around actual historical people, and they have high historical value because they reflect the mind, the aspirations, the hopes and fears of ancient Israel.
So Israel kept these legends because they were reading about themselves in the patriarchs. They saw the terms of their own existence, their own isness in these stories.
You've got it. The patriarchs function as these theological representatives for Israel's entire history. The Abraham cycle, for instance, it perfectly models the Exodus and the settlement.
The call out of the known world, Mesopotamia, which is like Egypt.
To an unseen destiny in Canaan.
Yes. And then you get Jacob, the great schemer. How does his story work as a national model?
The Jacob cycle, it models the kingdom era. It's all about the tension between human manipulation. Jacob is the heel grabber,
Yeah.
a cheat, often a pretty disreputable character,
Yeah.
and divine grace. His stories are preserved because they affirm that election is unmerited, a reality maintained solely by the grace and love of God, even when the nation itself is deeply sinful.
It's almost a national admission, like, we know we're flawed, but God chose us anyway.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, you have Joseph, whose story is different. It's much more tightly integrated, not as episodic as Abraham's or Jacob's.
Right, it feels more like a complete novella.
It does. And the Joseph story corresponds to the exile and the subsequent messianic hope. Joseph, one from the brothers, survives incredible odds, gets power, and ends up saving the entire family. He embodies the hope of a purified remnant after a catastrophe.
And that famous line he says,
You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. That is the core articulation of Israel's belief, that God can convert human evil into a divine redemptive purpose.
wow, that deep dive into the context is it's essential. Understanding that the man who received this world-changing call was a prosperous, polytheistic, semi-nomadic guy from Mesopotamia, it just makes his choice to obey so much more profound.
It's the foundational truth of the whole narrative. Faith begins not with human searching or self-generated piety, but with a sovereign, disruptive divine call to a very unrighteous and very human man. The stories never sanitize him, confirming that the covenant's success relied only on God's unwavering commitment to his own word.
And that sense of paradox, that tension between the impossible promise and the flawed human recipient, it all climaxes in the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. Israel understood that God was asking Abraham to sacrifice the only tangible evidence of the promise itself. Building on everything we've talked about, here's a final provocative thought from him. Abraham was first asked to abandon a known civilized life for an unseen, irrational promise, and much later, to sacrifice the only visible means of that promise being fulfilled. How does that tension between the divine demand to trust and the rational improbability of the divine promise relate to the way you approach certainty and security in your own life today? We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.